My name is Charlene Margot, and I am co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture. We are delighted to have with us tonight Dr. Devorah Heitner, who will be talking about her wonderful new book, Growing Up in Public. Take it away, Devorah.
Well, I'm really glad to be with you this evening. And I know that a lot of us who work with kids, whether we live with live with kids at home or work with kids in a school or in a community organization, just have so many questions about how we can help kids navigate this digital world. And there's so many things that we worry about, frankly, as adults who, maybe didn't grow up with this stuff and seeing the challenges our kids facing. And just today, there was a great article in the New York Times that everyone should have a look at about 13-year-old girls and like what they see. And what's really great is if you go to the online version of the New York Times, you can hear some of their voices talking about social media. And I, having spent the last, 5 years talking with kids, I love that. I don't have a multimedia way to like share the kids' voices, but I hope I can make some of the voices of the kids from my research also come alive for you tonight. Because kids have a lot to say and they're thinking a lot about these issues. I'm going to share my screen with you and hopefully, let's see, here we go. Did that work?
Perfect.
Okay. So we know that kids have a lot to say about these issues. And so the kids that whether they're your students, your clients, or your own kids at home, will have a lot to say if you ask them. And the thing we need to do is listen more than we talk, right, with social media, and anything related to kids growing up in public, gaming, YouTube, really any of the experiences kids have with screens, and especially the things where they create and connect. We're not the experts. They're the experts. Not that we have nothing to offer. We have a lot to offer them in terms of mentorship and support, but we need to not just talk at them, because I think they're at this point very leery of what adults seem to misunderstand. And they have seen adults be very reactive and sometimes really, kind of rush to judgment about some of the ways this stuff works, and maybe in some ways misunderstand kids' experience and intent. Just a bunch of issues that may come up for, most families. And I want to think especially about these issues as a frame for how we talk about kids' experience of coming of age online. So relationships is huge, right? Both peer relationships and family relationships. Many of us have texted our kids when we're home. We may also can be connected with our kids in some ways on social media. Reputation is one of the huge motivations for me, was one of the huge motivations to write Growing Up in Public, because after Screenwise, so many families said to me, well, I feel reassured about my kids' screen time, or I understand that screen time isn't the most helpful phrase, because, we want to think about the differences between ways kids consume and create media. But what do I do about the fact that my 13-year-old is very impulsive, or my 16-year-old, might share something that might really kind of blow up their life? Or what about my kid applying to college? How much should I worry about what they share? So all of these questions I address in the book, and a lot of them, hopefully the answers are reassuring. I can come back to the college thing if people have questions about that. But in general, kids are also feeling somewhat inhibited and aware of their reputations in ways that might stress them out. So it's something to think about. Another issue that kids are facing growing up in public is self-esteem, and especially the ways that social media and other kinds of connection and sharing online are so quantifiable. You can see how many followers you have, and you can see how many likes and how much response you have, and you can also compare that with others. And that can be, stressful for our kids, of course. And these things are just designed really well. They're designed to keep us there, and the likes and the, having the numbers of followers be visible taps into what makes us the most human, which is all of us want to be seen, regarded, understood. So that's kind of a lot to navigate. And then finally, time management. How do we get anything done when we're like trying to do our work at the sort of site of the party? And how do we navigate, as I wait for news, or as I, experience things online, or, as I launched my book last week, there's just a tremendous pull to like keep checking back, right, to see how things are going, to the point where then it becomes hard to focus on anything else. And I think all of us are in situations where our time management is negatively affected by, our lack of ability to self-regulate with tech. And we have to look at the design at that point and say, well, why is it so hard? And, maybe we need to redesign the tech, maybe we need to redesign our spaces at home, or put the devices away. But what do we need to do to be able to function and make choices about how we spend our time, as opposed to kind of going down the rabbit hole? So I've been saying this for years that every day is picture day, but the more I talk to kids about their body image and the ways it feels like to be photographed, growing up in the digital age, the more important I think these conversations are, because so many kids do feel so aware of how they look from a younger age because we're photographing so much in the home, because photography is kind of ubiquitous. Their friends have devices with cameras. If they have touch pads at school, like iPads or other tablets, they may have a camera on their school device. There's just so much photography going on and so much documentation of our children's lives. And there are many use cases and situations where that becomes challenging. One of the ones that I ran into when I was interviewing kids for the book and families for the book was transgender kids, right? So if you have a kid who was kind of identified with their gender assigned at birth, and then at some point they come out as transgender and they're potentially using a new name and presenting differently, that entire record of the past then becomes complicated. And the fact that it's not just shared within the family, but that it's public and that other people may have access to and even ownership or have, somehow shared those images, can make kids and families feel quite out of control. And that's just one case. Like, there are many kids who are not transgender, who identify with their gender assigned at birth, who nonetheless don't feel like they want to identify with some way that they presented themselves in the past, or the ways that their parents represented them in the past. And so those photos can become problematic for them too. So the very act, I have a whole chapter in the book about what I call sharenting, which is our urge as parents, of course, to share these wonderful children that we have. And I'm very sympathetic to that desire. I would love to share more of my 14-year-old. You look at my Instagram and you'll be like, she has a kid, you'll never see him, right? Because he doesn't want to be shared. And, that's a bummer, honestly. I would love to share him, but it's really important to honor and respect kids' privacy. And when they say, please don't share me, we have to listen. And so I've got one of those kids. Maybe you have a kid who's like, share me away. And that's great, right? Maybe that works for your family. So every family and every kid is different. One issue that was fun that I talked about in the book is that sometimes there'll be one kid in the family who's like very public and another who's private. And then, one mom was telling a story of looking through her social media, and the kid who was more private was like, oh, I can see who your favorite kid is, like speaking about their sibling. And the mom was like, dude, you said we can't photograph you, right? So this is like, sharenting is one of those games that's hard to win, because no matter how we share our kids, they might get mad at us later, even if they don't mind in the moment. Other parents are kind of playing the comparison game. So a lot of times we share because we want to kind of, maybe we wouldn't say brag, but we want to celebrate the achievements of our children. And that can be complex when other people are doing it. And maybe your kid is struggling in that moment, or you're not feeling as certain about what your kid is up to right now, or your kid is kind of in between things to be awesome at, which is totally legit and okay, right? You don't need to always be kind of on the path somewhere. You can just be like exploring your life. Like when we were kids, we didn't have these sort of professionalized, resumes. We were not like out there, being famous. Unless I have any child celebrities with us on the Zoom tonight, but for most of us, we were just kind of being ordinary and being ourselves and, hanging around and doing whatever. And there wasn't as much of a need to sort of talk about our achievements, even with friends or family. But social media has kind of created this space where we all feel some obligation or pressure potentially to speak about our kids, especially when others are doing it. So it also depends, who your friend group is, right? So we really want to make sure that when we are sharing about our kids, we're doing it for, the best possible reasons. And we want to ideally explore some alternatives. So if we need more community as a parent, can we join a local parenting group? Can we talk to a close friend who maybe lives in another city, but preserving our kids' privacy? Can we talk to our siblings who have raised kids? Like, are there people, like, I'm not saying parents should be alone and lonesome. I think we all need more community, especially after the last few years. But how can we get it in ways that doesn't compromise, our kids' privacy? Because when I do go out into schools, and I was just in a middle school in California last week, I was at Stanley Middle School in Lafayette, and the kids were like, I said, how many of you have had a friend share your picture without permission? And like a few hands went up. And then I said, how about your parents? And like almost every hand went up. And this is pretty consistent with my experience of schools around the country and a little bit around the world, but certainly all over the US, is that kids feel like their parents are just sharing them, rampantly and without permission. So especially as they get older, we want to make sure we allow them to have some control over their reputation or digital footprint, How are they being seen? And if they search back through your pictures, is there going to be a kind of a moment of like distrust that happens? A lot of the kids I talked to for the book describe seeing their mother or father's Facebook or Instagram for the first time and being kind of horrified. So if that could be you, make sure you like maybe do some pruning now before that happens. And also just be in conversation with your kid. By asking them permission, you're teaching them a really important consent-based boundary. And that's going to pay dividends when it comes time to talk about things like sexting and sharing nude photos and other things, that you've created a really strong sense of like, this is my boundary. It's okay not to share. I'm not going to, be pressured to share. I can share or not share if I want. I want to talk about Discord because it's a space where a lot of our young people are creating community. And it's also a space that a lot of parents are less familiar with, and other adults I'm finding are a little less familiar with. So some of you probably are pretty familiar with Discord or maybe use it yourself. Discord started out as a space for gamers to talk. And if you remember the sort of old internet from the 90s, in some ways, Discord really reminds me of that. There's like listservs and, rooms, and you can chat both with audio or in text form. I did talk to a young woman who was in a Discord that she was moderating, and the Discord was about the television show Schitt's Creek. It was a fan-based Discord. And then within the Discord, there were numerous servers where people chat. And the server she was moderating was called Girl Talk. And in the Girl Talk chat server, she was supposed to both enforce the rules, kick people out if they violated the rules of communication and discourse, and report any mental health issues, like someone talking about suicidality or self-harm. And that's a pretty heavy responsibility. And she would send them, information. She had, like, from the other moderators, gotten things like, these are chat lines they can call if someone is feeling suicidal or at risk. They can, we can share these resources. So this kid was 13 and in 8th grade. And I thought, wow, that's a pretty heavy responsibility without a lot of probably mental health training or experience. And I asked her if her parents knew about her moderator role on Discord. And she was like, I don't think so. And I was like, hey, that might be a good thing to talk to them about. So these are just like questions to ask your kids. Like if they say I'm a mod, it could be that they're like a gaming mod and their role is to like kick people out for bad language. There's a huge range of what moderating could mean, but it's really important to ask kids about these things. And not, again, like I have really come out strongly for not sort of spying on kids in an invasive way, but we do want to be in an ongoing conversation with them about their experiences of digital connection and their membership in digital communities, which is different than just like putting Bark or some other app on their phone and like tracking everything or tracking their location. I don't think you could, if you wanted to, even keep up with all the texts that this kid was moderating in the server. Like it would be your full-time job, like it's practically her full-time job. But I do think we want to be in the conversation, right? Ideally your 13-year-old isn't responding to people who are suicidal and sending them support, and you don't know that they're having that experience, because again, that's a lot of responsibility, and I would want to know. So I want to talk a little bit about gaming, because gaming can be a space also for identity formation and community. We want to support our gamers. We want to make sure that they know if discourse is really uncivil and not nice in a gaming community, that they can get out. If we're having struggles with like time on game or time on social media, anything that brings the kid back to their body, drinking a glass of water, doing a push-up, running around the block, can be a really good way to reconnect with the body and slow down the mind and return to kind of daily life. Charlene's seen this slide before because I've shown this for years, because I'm like obsessed with the wackiness, and maybe some of you work for Google and can explain like why YouTube, the algorithms work the way they do. But I've spent a lot of time on YouTube and TikTok in the last 5 years and talking to kids, and the algorithm is wacky. I mean, TikTok, people love the algorithm. It knows not just that you like cats, but like what color cats, what music you like with your cats, how many seconds of cats you'll watch before you scroll to the next cat video. And YouTube is, similarly like quite robust in its algorithm. Like it also knows a lot about what you like, but here it is saying like, hey, you like pandas, why don't you check out Women in Religious Cults from Conspiracy Doc? And I think it's fair to say that I don't want to see Women in Religious Cults from Conspiracy Doc. And I'm not sure why the algorithm thinks I would make that connection, but this is why any of these algorithmic based platforms like YouTube or TikTok, definitely for younger kids, you want to be supervising, but even with teenagers, you want to be having conversations about what they're seeing. One of the things I've been talking a lot with teenagers in recent years is about kind of hateful things, especially on YouTube, but also TikTok, where someone is targeting a group or using humor that's sort of like edgy, but it's actually really targeting a group in a way that's not okay. So one of the things we can talk to our kids about is the way that teenage boys, and I would say like especially white male teenage boys, but really like teenage boys are in general, and some teenage girls are like targets for hate groups, really, to recruit. And there's a lot going on that's kind of adjacent to that, that's pretty toxic on YouTube and Reddit and Quora and a lot of other spaces on the internet. And what I've seen is that a lot of kids are like, oh, I'm immune to that. I can watch, I'll just say, like, I can watch Andrew Tate and like I won't be affected by it. Like, it'll be fine. It's a hate watch for me. And one of the things I really want to convince our kids and help our kids understand is that there is, like, yes, you can hate watch something, but you're giving them your money if they've monetized their platform, first of all. So if you hate what Andrew Tate is saying and what he stands for, you don't want to watch that, because you're actually supporting the platform with your eyeballs, and every play, every view, that's supporting what he's doing. Secondly, you're getting yourself used to hateful language that you want to be shocked and surprised by. You don't want to hear slurs. You don't want to hear misogyny. You don't want to hear racism, because the more you spend time in that toxic stew, the more it starts to normalize for you. So those are two really important reasons that even if your kid is like, I don't believe in this stuff, and the thing is, like, they probably don't. When kids say that, I don't believe that they're like secretly haters and they're, just saying that. I really believe that a lot of kids are watching this stuff out of outrage, out of disgust, just like sometimes we do things like this. But it's so, so important that they take that energy and take that time and find the other, say they're watching something racist, like work with the other kids at your school to do anti-racist work in the school, in the community. There's a lot of work out there to be done. There's book bans to protest, there's reading to be done, there's conversations to be had. If you're listening to misogyny or homophobia, what can you do to support the targeted communities there? Versus spending time like hate watching something, which again is like rewarding that person. And it doesn't work. Like, I could type in a comment on Andrew Tate's YouTube, like, I'm Devorah and I disagree with you. And how effective do you think that would be in like changing the direction of what he's saying? It's not going to be effective. So more effective is I find other people in my community and we work on these issues, right? And so we really need to work on that with kids. And that's a conversation we can have. We want to be mentoring more than we're just monitoring. We don't want to just track our kids on Life 360. There's a bunch of stuff in the book. And interestingly, I wrote an Atlantic article that's an excerpt from the book and talked about not tracking kids on Life 360 and not, reading all of their texts. And I got such interesting responses, like some very positive, some very negative, including people who are like, she must not have kids. I can't believe she's not into geo-tracking, all the way to, I'm so glad I'm 75. I'm so glad, that my parents didn't geo-track me everywhere. It's a fascinating world that we live in. The fact that we can geo-track our kids does not mean we should do it. Certainly if it's driving up anxiety, causing distrust in the relationship, then it's something to rethink. So I'm not here tonight to tell you what to do in your own home, but I am here to say if it's causing anxiety, then you probably want to rethink it, right? You want to really look at these things, because a lot of times we think more data will make us feel better and be reassuring. And often it's the opposite. It can lead to misunderstandings. Another book to look at is Kashmir Hill from the New York Times has a privacy book that's out yesterday about facial recognition. I'm trying to remember, is it called like Who Owns Your Face? Anyway, I'm sure it's going to do really well and everyone's going to want to read it. And she's a brilliant reporter. I cite her in the book on location tracking. She location tracked her husband with his permission for New York Times. And there was just so many misunderstandings, especially if you're in a dense urban area like New York, where they are, he would go into a place, like he went into a place to like get breakfast, but it looked like a bar because like there was a, another thing in the building, or he went to get his hair cut and it it raises a lot of confusion. And you have to think about if you'd want your child's romantic partner or friends to be tracking them the same way. Now, I know you might say, well, they are because they're on Snap Maps. And it's true. There are a lot of kids using Snap Maps and they're tracking their friends with the incredibly predictable result that sometimes your kid will feel terrible because they can see the friends on Snap Maps and they're all together without your friends. This is why I'm glad to be an adult and that my friends don't all know each other. So the likelihood that they're all together without me is extremely low. The likelihood that I'm home on a Saturday night and that many of my friends are doing cooler things is a little higher. And so I think Snap Maps still has the potential to make me feel terrible. But unlike high school, there's not like one click. I think it's really important that we talk with our kids about the surveillancy pieces of things like Snap Maps as well as Life 360. And if they are tracking us, we may want to think about that too. I will say that I did talk to some parents of young adults who kind of boomeranged home, especially in the early days of the pandemic. And the adult parents were like using Life 360 to track their adult kids to get some privacy and be like, okay, they're out for a little while. So, game respects game, right? Whatever you need to do. I understand why people would do that, but I just think there are more hazards, again, to geo-tracking our families than advantages potentially. So it's worth really thinking about, why are you doing it? Another way we tend to track our kids, and here's surveillance via apps. Another way we track our kids is we set them up on these grading apps. And when I was at my son's high school orientation a few weeks ago, I was told like, you've got to get on this app and that app. So for us, it's like Power School and Canva, but there's like a million of these apps. Canva is that, art making app. But there's so many apps where you can track your kids' grades, attendance. My kid also has a QR code or some kind of code that he's like swiping to get into the cafeteria. So they know if he skipped lunch. I'm like, I probably skipped lunch like every day of high school. I don't really care if my kid skips lunch. Like, I don't need him to be location tracked during the school day in his 3,000 person high school in this massive building. It's a closed campus. It's like not in an urban area. There's like nowhere for him to go. I mean, I wish there was somewhere for him to go near there, but there's like, the only thing near my kid's high school campus is a Home Depot. So I don't think many kids do leave, but I think the feeling that you get by having to swipe in is a level of surveillance that I'm frankly not sure we want kids to get so cozy with. And the grading apps put parents in this situation where you become your child's executive function / nagging machine. And I feel, both as someone who grew up with ADHD and as someone who struggles with executive function to this day, like, I'm so glad my parents didn't have this app, because I think I would have had more conflict. Is there some world where maybe I would have had better grades and more options coming out of high school if someone had been able to track me? Like, possibly. But at the same time, I can only imagine the amount of stress. And when I talk to kids, grading apps actually lead to even more stress and conflict, even than location tracking. The number one thing that kids hate is having you read their texts. And the number two thing is if you're over checking their grades. So those are two tracking things that were like pretty universally despised. I will say I met a fairly large subset of kids who were like, I don't mind if my parents geo-track me as long as they're not creepy or as long as I know. So that was sort of the caveat. I did not meet any kids who were comfortable with their parents reading their texts or felt like that was a great idea. And most folks said that the grading stuff causes conflict for a million reasons. One is that teachers will post, and then, there's like a time lag, or parents are getting the information sometimes before their kids. Your kids are very busy during the school day. Maybe you have a little more flexibility during the day, or you have some downtime at work and you go to check. Do not text your kids at school about their grades. They're already at school, right? The last thing you need is like to be in AP Calc and get a worried text from your mom about your history grade. So don't do that. But also, kids need to not do that. I've talked to a lot of kids who really need to take the grading app off their phone and leave it on a less frequently checked device. And they do not make it easy. For my son, like, all of the information he needs for everything, like where the assignments are, is also in this silly app. And so it's really hard to get away from it. But I will say, if it cannot be on the phone, that's ideal, because kids need to be able to not be habitually checking their school app or their grade point average as frequently as they check Instagram. So that's something to think about. We know that kids' digital world can be like complicated. We know that there can be fights and arguments. Unfortunately, I'm hearing from schools about physical fights that are, shared like on places like TikTok. And I was interviewed today by Haaretz magazine or Haaretz newspaper in Tel Aviv, and they were telling me about a video of a fight gone viral, like in Israel. I've talked to people in, the UK about these stories. So this is like happening internationally, not even just here in the US. We need to help kids with their conflict resolution skills, right? We need to help kids know, hey, if I'm in a group text, I have options. If people are being mean, I can leave the group text. I can go directly to the person who's not being nice. I can go to the person who's being targeted and express solidarity. So when I was with those middle school kids, last week, those were some of the options that I was sharing with them. So we need to teach kids that they have choices in that situation. And sometimes leaving is not going to be the choice that they choose, but it's good to know that that's an option, or taking a break. It's also fair to let them know, as much as we don't want to over surveil them, that somebody's mom or dad is probably on that 6th or 7th grade group text. And if it is possible that someone might get in trouble if a text chain is going in a really bad direction, it's probably a good idea to get off if you think, somebody's going to get in trouble for it, because you want to kind of be on record of like, I'm gone, I left, I did not want to be part of that conversation, right? We cannot expect kids always to upstand every time things go wrong. I think that's unrealistic, and that's not what we do. I've left a lot more Facebook dumpster fires on my, parenting websites or teacher websites or whatever. Most of them have been pretty nice, of course. Twitter, as we can imagine, has had some moments where things are less good. I mostly would just say leave, right? Digital conflict is not something you can often solve as a single person. Going directly to the person who's being a jerk can be helpful, or doing something you don't like, or expressing a boundary. And when we don't do it in front of everyone, we're more likely to get the result we want. When you call someone out in front of others, often people will double down. Whereas if you go to someone privately and say, hey, I don't use that nickname anymore, please don't call me that, they have a choice. Obviously, they can be like a not nice person about it, and then you kind of have information about them that you can use to make decisions about further interactions. Or they might be like, oh, I feel really bad, I'm going to make a change, I'm sorry, right? So it's worth a try. And especially if you have a relationship that's more ongoing with somebody. What I do encourage kids not to do, and you see more like 5th and 6th and 7th graders do this than high schoolers, is just block somebody. Like the minute someone angers you, you can't just immediately go to blocking them. Like, can you imagine if we did that with our families? And then like later in the day, like your brother-in-law is trying to text you and he's like, I can't get through. Is your number broken? You have to be like, oh, you annoyed me, so I blocked you. Like, that's not a strategy that's going to work. You can't do that at work. Right. So we need to teach kids, like, blocking is like for strangers who are harassing you, or someone who's continually bullying you and you've tried everything else, like, and you're cutting off contact, fine. If it's the kid who sits next to you at lunch and 80% of the time you're friends and 20% of the time they're pretty annoying, that's probably not someone we block. That's someone we might set some limits with. Right. So those are some things to kind of think about. Okay. Let's see here. And I'm just seeing, yes, I see someone asking, what if the kids are the ones over checking their grading app? I think it's really important to make sure that we talk with kids about not over checking, and potentially encourage them, especially if they're in therapy or if they're diagnosed with anxiety, that suggestion may be better coming from their therapist, where maybe we encourage them to take it off their phone and use it on a less frequently checked device. And also maybe even put the password somewhere else so they have to go somewhere. Like basically anything where we can create friction where they're not over checking, because we really only saw our grades a couple of times a semester, or when we got our report card, and it's not clear, especially for an anxious kid who's maybe over prone to checking, that checking so regularly is helpful. And when I interviewed some 9th graders at a boarding school for my book, and I was asking, and it was a boys' school, and I was asking them about how do you feel about these not having a grading app? Because this was a progressive school and they didn't have a grading app, but they'd all come from middle schools that had it. And they were all like, oh, we hate it. We miss it. We have no idea how we're doing. And I just thought, oh, what do you mean you have no idea how you're doing? And I really pushed on that. Because of course, you as a former professor and as someone who's a teacher, I'm like, you mean you walk into class, you're like participating in the discussion, you're doing the reading, you're feeling the vibes, and you don't know how you're doing, or like you have no idea, or you walk into French class and the teacher's going like la 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 and you have no idea, or you're like in it and understanding and you're speaking French and you're doing your pair exercises and you're passing your tests. Like, you can kind of tell how it's going, right? You shouldn't need, and they were like, yeah, but then we can't calibrate our efforts exactly to get an A and C. We need exactly 2.5 more points. And go to the teacher and say, what do I have to do for 2.5 more points? And I was just like, crushed because of course I think, personally, I'm not a fan of grades at all as extrinsic motivation. So I was just like, oh, great. So you really want to titrate your effort to that degree. It's not about the learning at that point. So that's frustrating. Anyway, this slide shows us what kids understand inherently about online interactions, which is that there's a tremendous amount of disinhibition that happens when we comment online. So there's a lot of, and I've seen this. I mean, again, I had the articles last week in the Atlantic, and, I had something in the Washington Post, and some of the comments, and those were like my bylines. So when those people are commenting, it's like to me. There was an article about my book in the New York Times, and like the people commenting on that also pretty much just had read the headline. But what happens when we're commenting, whether it's on someone's YouTube page or an article in the Washington Post, is that we disengage from the sort of accountability that we would feel in person, like at a dinner party, like say I walked up to somebody at a dinner party and another friend introduced me and said she just wrote a book. You probably wouldn't be like, well, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard. Like, that's probably not how you'd respond. Even if in your head you were like, I don't like her glasses, or, I'm not interested in kids growing up in public, whatever. You probably wouldn't say that out loud because you would be inhibited, because we're social creatures and we're nice to each other pretty much in those kinds of situations. And you'd be like, oh, that's so interesting. And then you would, like, if you really didn't think it was interesting, you'd like go find someone else to talk to, or be like, oh, gotta run. Right. But you wouldn't be like straight to my face, that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard. What are you thinking? Which is what people do sometimes when they're online trolls. One of my favorite episodes of oh my gosh, what's it called? The Staten Island Vampire, What We Do in the Shadows show, is where the vampires meet an actual internet troll, and he turns out to be like an actual troll, right? And he's just like this trolly troll, right? He's not a human being. He's like, because it's an otherworldly show. There's vampires too, right? So we're out of the realm of real people and into the realm of fantastic. And it's just very fun that he gets his energy from trolling people on the internet, because of course that is like a thing that happens when our kids put themselves out there, whether it's your 11-year-old with a YouTube channel or your 16-year-old on TikTok. People might troll them. And it's just unbelievable to me in some ways what someone might say, even to a child, let alone a teenager. But we have to recognize that for little kids, ideally, you're just not having comments or the ability to be commented from strangers, because as much as your 10-year-old might want to be an influencer, it's probably not worth the risk to their emotional health to get those comments. Now, if you have a teenager who's an activist or an athlete and, or a singer or something, and they're really ready, or they feel ready to put themselves out there, I would say, I mean, that's still up to your family's discretion, but they may be more ready than a younger kid, but they're still going to potentially experience some of this online disinhibition and people just dumping whatever their, BS is, frankly, on your child. And it's not okay. Right. Like, I'm here to say, like, that it's not okay. And someone who would comment on your, 16-year-old's YouTube channel with their dancing or their surfing and talk about their ethnicity or their body or like anything other than like, great job, is like, that's not okay. But we live in that world where people do things that cross those lines. And so we need to make sure our kids are ready and kind of tough if they're going to put themselves out there with a public presence as a TikToker, as a YouTuber, if they're going to have this kind of public influential presence. And I talked with a bunch of actual influencers for the book to get a sense of what that's like, because young people, can be in really stressful situations when they've monetized their brand. And I wanted to understand what that was like. And, if you follow someone like Allison Stoner, I mean, they have a lot of things to say about this stuff. It's really worth being in these conversations. And I think right now we're in a moment of a lot of people really reflecting on what does it mean for kids to grow up as celebrities? What does it mean for families to decide to be influencers or not? Nora McInerney just did an episode of her podcast about a TikTok dad who was like showing his kids a lot and just suddenly had this kind of mea culpa moment and recognized that he might be kind of destroying their childhoods and that he should stop. So hopefully hopefully that all worked out. Maybe that family's getting some support now. I don't know. But if you listen to his story on the pod, it's very heart-wrenching about the ways that, being so exposed affected his children. Let's see. I want to talk a little bit about being left out and feeling excluded, because that's such a huge piece of the sort of price of the ticket of social media. And there's just so much experience for our kids. I mentioned Snap Maps. There's so many ways kids can sort of feel kind of left out, whether it's everyone has an app they don't have, whether kids are using some add-ons, whether kids are speaking in a coded language and your kid is like, what the heck are they talking about? So we run it like not leave kids on a bummer feeling bad. When I talk to kids in schools, I'll ask them, what are strategies you can use if you're being excluded? What are strategies you can use to be more inclusive? What are things you can do if you want to post something, but you're not sure if it'll leave somebody out? And these are opportunities, like if you run an advisory in your school or at your camp or any program, these are opportunities for young people to really reflect on like, what is my experience and what is a more ideal experience and how can I move a little bit more in that direction? And that's a really good thing for kids to start to imagine. For parents on here, anyone who's working with kids who are not yet on social media, I think preparing them, not like you're going to be excluded, it's going to be terrible, like not all gloom and doom, but running through some of these scenarios ahead of time is good, and kind of normalizing them. I talked earlier about the fact that we can quantify our influence and quantify the likes that we get. I think it's so important that we talk with kids about that experience and what that feels like. It's so important that they understand that we experience some of these things as well, and that we don't want them to sort of crowdsource their identity. We don't want them to only share the parts of themselves that are getting a certain kind of adulation. At the same time, we should understand that our kids are code switching online. And so if your kid has, for example, a spam account on Instagram, kids used to call them Finsta years ago, but now a lot of kids call them spam accounts, and they'll just be talking to a couple of friends there, that is actually probably a proactive privacy, protection for your kids, and not necessarily a sign that your kid is up to anything bad or wrong. Having a conversation that's not on your main account that fewer people can see is actually, I think, a sign that kids are maturely recognizing that different kinds of contexts for different kinds of conversations make sense. And that, when you see, frankly, adults on a group text or on a Facebook page, suddenly like having what seems like a very private conversation, they've kind of missed that memo, in fact. And so kids are, in many ways, not always, but better sometimes at understanding, wait, this is not a conversation for my main page. So they can be quite sensitive to audience, which I think is really cool. This is an app called No Shot that kids invented in one of my workshops. And it's about preventing folks from taking unpermitted screenshots, which is incredible because kids are very aware of the possibility of screenshots or preservation, and they're worried about getting canceled. They're worried about someone seeing them or sharing them doing something. And it's not a bad idea to teach kids the idea of mutually assured destruction, which I think in You're So Not Invited to My Bat Mitzvah is a really great example, that one of the girls, has kind of a file of all these gross videos of both of them. And it's like, there's like a booger video and there's just all these very, very embarrassing things. And even when she's in the deepest fight with her friend, she actually doesn't reveal the videos. It's her mother that ends up doing it sort of unwittingly. But I think we recognize that that's like one line too far, even though the conflict gets pretty far in the movie, not to spoil it for anyone, because it's like the nuclear option, but also it's mutually assured destruction. Like, because surely the friend has some equally super embarrassing videos of her. And so one of the things we want to teach our kids is, even if you break up with someone as a friend or as a boyfriend or girlfriend, you don't really want to go trying to blow up their lives with like the embarrassing videos, because there's like a really good chance that there's like some text that out of context would not sound good, or something that they could share. And so we don't want to teach our kids to be paranoid, but I think that they should be aware, and they should not be blowing things up outside of, friend groups, or trying to induce someone to say something that will sound really bad out of context. It's really important that our kids recognize sort of not to do that. I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. Okay, so I'm going to talk for a few more minutes, and then we're going to go to Q&A because I see a couple of questions. Let's see. Yes. Okay, I see some good questions here. All right. So I just want to get to like a couple more things. I always like to talk about sleep for a second. If you win one battle, or if you pick one battle with your kids about anything with tech, taking the devices at night or doing things externally to help regulate and get to sleep is ideal. And as they get older, making sure they're trying to self-regulate and get some sleep. Most elementary and middle schoolers and early high schoolers are not going to be able to self-regulate without some assistance, I'll say, with going to bed at night. So Eventually, sometime before they leave you to go to college or wherever they're going after high school, certainly it's a good idea for them to have practice with self-regulation. Most 12 and 13-year-olds, most even 14-year-olds, most certainly 10 and 11-year-olds are not able or ready to self-regulate with a connected device in their bedroom at night. And sometimes, that 10-year-old actually might be pretty compliant, but you have to remember that 10-year-old very soon will be potentially like an 8th grader in love or an 8th grader who loves to game. And that kid might never sleep if they have something, connected at night. So it's very important. We know physical and mental health, are so tied up with our sleep. Kids love to get advice from other kids. This is a TikTok where teenagers are giving teenagers dating advice. You might want to make sure your kids have other sources of information about health, about sexuality, about consent, even about friendship issues. We want to make sure our kids balance all this online affinity in these spaces like Discord, where kids are doing all this important identity work. In the book, I write a lot about the ways kids with marginalized identities, like LGBTQ plus kids, neurodivergent kids, kids who've been through mental health experiences or have diagnoses, might find and do find affinity online. The flip side is we want to make sure that any kid who's needing that kind of online affinity has also got some kinds of in-person support. So if a kid's struggling with their mental health, we want them to also have an actual therapist, right? Or a counselor at school. We don't want them to just be getting that support from TikTok or Discord. This can be especially tricky when kids want to self-diagnose. I'm happy to take questions about any of this stuff, but these are some of the things that, we sometimes run into in these spaces that are tricky. Friendship itself is not so different from how it was when we were kids. So I think we don't need to over kind of exoticize our kids and feel like they're so different than we ever were. Our kids are amazing. And friendship is, in many ways, a lot like it was for us. The intensity of teenage friendships, the importance of them, the desire to really show up and be a good friend. If your kids' tech behavior changes dramatically, it might be not that your kid's in a crisis, they might be trying to carry a friend through a crisis. It's a good idea to remind kids that some of the sort of flags that might be in when something crosses the line and they need to go to an adult. Kids can really support each other through a lot, and it's great to be there for their friends. So what you want to do is validate, I'm glad you're there for your friend. But if your friend, is talking about self-harm, if your friend is suicidal, if your friend has an eating disorder or a substance use disorder, you can be there for them, but you can't be their 24/7 hotline, and you need to encourage them to tell an adult, or if they refuse to tell an adult, you need to tell an adult. And that is your ethical obligation. And the test for me, and it's different at different ages, what, as a parent, when would I call another adult about something my kid told me? It's very different in elementary school versus middle school versus high school. By high school, you're really looking at, it's not like another kid used a bad word, for example. I would never call an adult about that. But it's anything where there's an outcome that seems like it could come from this, where I could not live with myself if I hadn't said anything. Right? If there's an outcome where it's like if we're here and the kid is making a threat against self, against other, then I'm okay, my first choice is that kid self-reports. My second choice is my kid goes to someone. If they come to me, I may have to anonymously phone that in or something, to a bullying hotline or to a school mental health hotline. These are some great resources, depending where you are. I mean, I can try to find resources if people ask me in the chat, and I think, Parent Venture may have some good resources that are national and local to different places, but it's hopefully in your own school district, there are resources where you can report things if you must. And again, that would be my litmus test. So it's not about tattletaling. For example, even though I don't want kids abusing substances, if it doesn't happen in my home, if it's just hearsay, for me, that wouldn't necessarily rise to the level of I must report that. It's like if I heard, if my kid came home and said some kids were vaping in the bathroom, for example, I don't know where I got that idea, but I don't I wouldn't necessarily feel the need to I must call that in. I'm just filing that in my brain, but there's other things that frankly are more threatening and harmful, and where I couldn't, again, live with that outcome, where I would call it in. Okay. I want to make sure I get to everyone's questions.
And Deborah, I'm going to join you for questions too. So you just let me know.
Okay.
When you're ready.
Yeah, so I wrote a lot about the sexting in the book, so we can talk about sexting too. I have a whole chapter on sexting, which is like every parent's favorite topic, I'm sure. When you have your baby, you just like dream of talking to them someday about sending nudes. It's like the first thing you think, like that'll be fun. Just kidding. But I think it's really important to have proactive conversations with kids about sexting that are not threat-based so that they can come to you if they're in a jam. I have much more to say about that, but that's where I'll leave us for right now. And I want to go to these questions. So Charlene, do you want to ask them, did you say, or?
Yeah, and I've got some other questions that have come in earlier. So,
Okay.
first of all, thank you. That was incredible, incredible. And parents, listen, I have been reading and talking to Devorah for a long, long time. This book is really, really good. She covers so much. But I want to start out by asking, we've been having this conversation for a long time that you advise mentoring over monitoring or surveillance. Our kids today are under so much surveillance. Why do you think it's more important now than ever that parents really do that?
I think we really need to have a hard look at, as a society, at the surveillance we're under and ask ourselves some questions about, and if you want to like reread a classic, from 20 years ago, Cory Doctorow's Little Brother, which I just reread this summer, holds up really well as kind of a disturbing look at how much surveillance we're all under. But especially in families, what I found is it just increases conflict and decreases trust. Again, you would think that tracking each other would increase trust, but it doesn't seem to work that way. Parents are often misunderstood or feel like they misunderstand. One of the people I wrote about in the Atlantic article talked about, she learned this is how she learned her son was in a relationship, and her son is 17, and she found out he was like going to a girl's house, and I think eventually what she learned is he probably would have told her about the relationship. And I'm like, well, maybe he just wasn't sure if it was going anywhere. And like, don't you want to wait until he's ready to tell you? And is this how you want to find out about your kids' relationships? And do you ever want to meet like the next 5 girlfriends, frankly, like, because the kid is 17, and like, because he's not going to introduce you to anyone now if you found out because you're tracking him. Like my point is like, this is not going to go where you want it to go? And she sort of felt sort of triumphant, like, I found out he was dating someone and eventually he brought her around. And I was like, well, why didn't you just wait for that?
Well, Deborah, it reminds me of our friend Madeline Levine, who used to say, I worry not about kids rebelling. I worry about when they don't rebel.
Mm-hmm.
You say in the book that they kind of acquiesce. They're so used to it. And yet, should they be used to it? I mean, there's a good question here from our friend Ned Johnson, Deborah. He says, can you talk more about what we should know about kids who are surveilled by parents learning to succumb to others, or subsuming their own autonomy, or learning to avoid help because of
Yeah, I mean, this is where, especially if you had a child who then they're like, what if you say you must track your location? And what if their romantic partner said to them? What if their romantic partner said, I need you to wear this Apple Watch and keep your location on at all times?
Yeah.
What would you think about that relationship? And the challenge is that, many kids are in positive relationships with their parents. And a lot of the research that, like, for example, I cite Mickalene Jensen quite a bit, who's at Greensboro and UNC Greensboro. And her whole research team is all about college students communicating with parents. And like, more than half of it is positive. Like, kids do text their parents more than we called our parents from, I'm going to date myself, but like from a payphone. And in and of itself, that increase in contact can represent an increased closeness, can represent using parents in a productive way. I think what it actually does also is it frankly exacerbates inequality. So if you have a kid like aging out of the foster system at 18 and they're truly on their own, we actually don't live in a society where we really launch at 18 and kids are kind of getting their hands held. Like when I was 18, I took a train to Chicago. I started college and my parents did not come to Chicago from New York, where I grew up, until I finished when I was 20. And I cannot conceive of doing that with my own child. Like if he wants to go to college abroad, I would still want to like fly there with him and at least see it. And I mean, there are a lot of factors in my own family that explain that. And I wouldn't say that was necessarily the same experience that my peers had, but I will say like it felt normal to me at the time. There was not a lot of communication, and yet I was not estranged from my parents. And to be clear, I was privileged and I benefited from them financially supporting me through that time. Now kids are very entwined with their parents, like tremendously, getting a lot of texts, and they're texting one of the biggest texts that Professor Jensen talks about is, what's my social security number? So right now I'm going to tell you, if you have a kid who's launching into college, one of the things I want you to do, in addition to talking about FERPA and HIPAA, which are both in my book, and that last chapter on launching kids, which we didn't really get into, but if you can like make sure they know they're social before they get on the bus or the train to go to college, or before you drop them off, because it's really an insecure thing to be texting them multiple times. So just a little tip. But yeah, so you were saying, Ned was asking about the consequences. The consequence is either kids may not trust themselves. They may not have an idea of what to do. Like, one of the things we want kids to do is literally ask directions if they're lost, right? And an example one dad gave me that's not in the book was his daughter was outside of an Airbnb where the family was staying, and she went back early, and she was like 18 or 19, and she was locked out. She couldn't figure out what to do. And she could see the Airbnb owner in the other unit, but she didn't want to knock on the door and like ask for help. She preferred to get her father to try to troubleshoot, and her father was somewhere else. And her father was like, no, ask the person who's there. Right. And so we need kids to be able to, like, what I say to my son is, you speak the local language. Like, if you're downtown Chicago and your phone dies or it doesn't work because of the tall buildings, there's other ways you can get directions. And if we're in our own country, like, you speak the local language, like try to, interact with another human and see if that could be helpful. Right. So we don't want our kids, to paraphrase Katie Davis, we don't want our kids to be app dependent. We want them to be app enabled. If your kid has dyslexia and using speech to text is expedient for them, that's a wonderful way to be enabled by an app. But we don't want our kids to be so dependent on mapping or Life 360 that they don't have even a B plan if that app, again, like, doesn't work for them or their phone dies.
Right. And Devorah, again, as a developmental educator, here's a quote from you. To me, parents, this is the bottom line. Quote, when parents fail to build trust-based relationships and healthy communication with their kids, talking with them later about issues will be really difficult. Hear that, parents. It's really important. Really important. So again, you got to start when they're 5, not when they're 15, because when you have those conversations about sexting, they're going to be really hard. All right, let's see what we can get to here, Devorah. Question, what are some strategies to control YouTube beyond screening off all the content?
Yeah, I mean, YouTube and TikTok are like the Wild West, and ideally for younger kids, they're being used adjacent to parents without headphones, because there are some things we really don't want kids to see. As they get older, we want to really communicate with our kids about how we expect them not to, use pornography or look at certain things or like hate content, like I was talking about. I don't think that it's always the wrong thing to do, by the way, to monitor. I will say that I don't think we want to monitor ever covertly. And I don't think we want to monitor with no plan for backing off. So I want to be really clear that I am not saying you should never, ever, ever sit down with your kid, for example, look at their texts. I think if you get your 12-year-old a phone, it might be a great idea to sit down with them a couple times and look with them at their texts. I met some founders in Seattle who have this way of like tracking YouTube. If I had a kid who was using YouTube a lot, I might say to them, hey, I'm going to track YouTube for a while. I want to see what you're seeing so we can talk about what you're seeing. Just like if they were watching Netflix, I might look at their history on Netflix and be like, oh, I see you're getting into Battlestar Galactica. I'm going to watch that with you. Or, oh, wow, there's a lot of, there was one of them, or, Squid Game. I see you watch the first one. Let's talk before you watch the rest. That's really violent. Like, let's have a conversation about that. So I'm not here to say, and I think people read the headlines about my work and they're like, what Devorah says is kids should swim without a lifeguard. And what I'm saying is swimming lessons, right? And which is not to say swim without a lifeguard, right? I'm just saying we have to also learn how to swim. But there are absolutely pieces of content I wouldn't want my own kid to watch. When he was in 6th grade, home for remote school, his babysitter, not really babysitter, but like tutor, was like, hey, great, Game of Thrones is really great. And I had to like have a chat with the 20-year-old who was hanging out with my kid during the pandemic and say, I don't really think that an 11-year-old needs to be watching Game of Thrones. Like, I get that you love it. That's totally cool. Like, so again, I'm not here to say like, don't monitor the content your kid watches at all. Don't talk with them about it. There's no limits at all, because I don't think that's healthy. And I think most kids would be grateful to be spared some of the trauma of like things they can never unsee. But we need to be in the conversation with them. And that's like giving them categories of like, these things are hateful, or this is going to give you ideas about sex and consent that are really inaccurate, as opposed to just being like, okay, hope for the best. or trying to keep them on kids' YouTube past, I don't know, 8. Like most kids are not going to be psyched about kids' YouTube by middle school or upper elementary school because there's all this content they want. So I think if we make it like the forbidden fruit, that gets really tricky.
Yeah.
I have run into kids who need a lot of supervision though on YouTube and TikTok in particular. So I will say, like, would it be nice if the apps would regulate some of the things we can see in those spaces? Yeah, it would make our jobs easier. I wouldn't mind seeing that happen at this point.
Yeah, but again, parents, educators, what Dr. Heitner is saying is communication is key. Mentoring is key. We are not sending them into the pool with no lifeguard. But I think your advice is so well taken, Devorah. We have time for just one quick more, and then I want a final word from you, okay? This is a question everybody wants to know. Do you recommend not allowing kids to be on social media at all? And if so, not until what age?
I don't recommend a complete abstinence approach because I think that makes social media this sort of forbidden fruit, and kids are very likely, if it's important to them to be with their friends, to found an account in secret, where we then aren't in a position to mentor them. If they're in a jam or getting threatened, harassed, gross messages, anything like that, like they can't come tell us. I do think an ideal situation would be first to really get good at texting. I don't think it's ideal to give a kid a phone and they get 3 social apps and texting the same day, because those are all different social skills to master. So ideally, kids are getting good at texting, getting comfortable and confident with group text, knowing what their standards are for communication in those spaces. And then ideally, if they can, just add 1 social app and you're communicating with them your expectations of, like, who are they in contact with? If they want to follow someone on that social app, if that's, say, like a celebrity, a movie star, an athlete, does that someone seem like a good example? Does that someone's behavior and speech and videos inspire you? There might be someone who's frankly really awesome on the field or on the screen in Hollywood who turns out not to be inspiring in their life choices. I mean, I will say yesterday, I was interviewed for Swiss TV yesterday. It's like a big media week for me. And they wanted to set up an Instagram account for a 13-year-old girl. And it was kind of funny because it was kind of like, does Instagram think it's 13 years ago? Because we set up the 13-year-old girl account and immediately we were invited to follow the Kardashians, Paris Hilton. And I was like, do 13-year-old girls even know who those people are? Because this feels like so 10 years ago. But anyway, I think, we can ask ourselves questions of, like, if my kid was going to follow any celebrity, would that be like the first person I would pick? Or would I be like scrolling for someone else? So I think we want to talk to our kids about all of that and what they're kind of inputting into themselves and what they're inspired by. But I don't think we want to just keep them off social media. I think keeping them completely off social media is tough. A lot of kids don't have each other's phone numbers, and it's predominantly how direct messaging is how they communicate. So it's so important that we give them, I think, access, if they want it, to one. And many kids will choose to mostly just message there. So you don't have to worry necessarily that your kid's going to become an overposter. Yeah. Some kids just choose Discord. My kid's only on Discord. So it really depends what your kid is into, but I think they should try to get good at texting first and then, add a social app. But I think for most kids, keeping them completely off social media is probably going to be a situation where they may go around you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like putting them in a much more dangerous situation than adding an app.
Well, 30 years ago, when parents said you can't watch TV, the kid would go down the street and watch TV all afternoon. So, Devorah, this has been incredible, such a rich conversation, but parents, there's so much more in her book.
Thank you. And I just want to say too, if you bought it already, thank you so much. And if you would like to review it, it's funny because for weeks I've been like, kids should not be quantifying their self-esteem, but now I'm like, but how many reviews do I have? So help me quantify my self-esteem, but then do as I say and not as I do. Please review the book.
Exactly. Well, again, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. So many friends that were with us, Devorah, and it was wonderful. We appreciate you, Dr. Heitner. We've been doing this many years and hopefully we'll be doing it lots of times again. Thank you, everybody. Take care. We hope to see you again soon. Good night.